Hey guys, today we're going to be beginning our chapter on Reconstruction. This is the last chapter of our course. This is going to offer a quick introduction to some of the problems that we're going to look at in more detail in later lessons. Here are your video goals. By the end of the video, you should be able to describe what the South was like at the end of the Civil War, to name the three big questions facing the North after the Civil War. You should be able to discuss why changing the South would be difficult and what the consequences would be if the North did not force the South to change. And finally, you should discuss how the South resisted change. At the end of the Civil War, the South was a shattered society. The old way of doing things had been more or less totally destroyed over the course of the 4 years of Civil War. One of the main things that had changed is that slavery was now legally ended. And this was crucially important because slavery was the foundation of the old system. The wealth, the social structure, basically everything about the South was determined by the fact that it was a slave society. And now with slavery gone, the old institutions, the old way of doing things was also gone. And so in order to go forward, the South had to figure out a new way of doing things. On top of this, the Southern economy was in ruins. Many people had lost their homes. Cities and farms were destroyed or abandoned. And so the South is broken and needs to be reconstructed, rebuilt. And the big question is, how is the South going to be rebuilt? And that's what we're going to look at more in a minute. One thing that's important to remember, though, is that even though a lot has changed, the same people who were in control at the beginning of the Civil War in the South are now in control of the South at the end of the Civil War. That is, rich whites. Former slave owners still own lots of land, are still the wealthiest people in this society, and they're the ones who would be able to make changes to the South, especially if everybody else ignored the South. They would be able to reconstruct society however they wanted. So after the Civil War, there are lots of problems to solve regarding the South and what's going to happen to the South. And some of the biggest questions during this period are, how will Southern society be rebuilt? What will be the fate of Southern African Americans? When will Southern states be allowed back into the United States? These three big questions divided Northerners. Some Northerners believed one thing, other Northerners believed another, and it was difficult to get Northerners to agree on this issue. On top of this, Southerners wanted to resist all change. They wanted to prevent anything from changing. And this made things even more difficult. Let's look now at the first big question, and this was, how would Southern society be rebuilt? Now, there were two options here. One is that the North could go down and force the South to change. The other is that the South should be allowed to rebuild itself. And both of these ideas have problems. If the North decided to go down and force the South to change, they would have to send a whole bunch of soldiers and other people down to the South and basically take it over. And this is problematic for a couple reasons. One is the South doesn't want to change, and so, or at least the white people in the South don't want it to change. And this would require a lot of time, and it would require a lot of money. The North would have to spend a whole bunch of money to reshape Southern society, which a lot of Northerners don't want to do. On the other hand, if the South is allowed to rebuild itself, this means that the rich former slave owners are going to be left in power. And that means that left on their own, the South would rebuild a society that was a lot like their old one. Of course, legally, slavery would be gone, but the South would write laws that would make it so that people in the South, or Black people in the South still lived as second-class citizens, and they would be forced to work their old jobs for very low wages. So if this happened, then it would be like nothing had really changed. The next big question, and we're going to talk more about this later, is what should happen to African Americans in the South? There are two options. One is that the North should make sure that African Americans have equal rights, and the other is that the North should allow African Americans to become second-class citizens in the South. So on the one hand, making African Americans equal, they would do this by forcing Southerners to allow African Americans to vote and to respect the civil rights of African Americans. And this would also mean that the North would provide certain basic services and necessities to newly freed African Americans until they were set up enough to take care of themselves and to vote and to control their own destinies. The problem with this, just like the last one, is that this would be expensive. And on top of this, many Northerners don't really care about what happens to Southern African Americans. They fought the war not so much to free African Americans, but rather to bring the South back into the country. So they don't really care too much about this, and they're not willing to spend lots of money. On the other hand, if the North allows African Americans to become second-class citizens, then what would happen is it would lead to conditions in the South a lot like slavery, which might lead to other divisions between North and South and would make the Civil War seem sort of pointless. So neither of these options are unproblematic. And last of all, we have the problem of what to do with the southern states, namely, when will they be allowed to return to the United States? And there are two options here also. One is to force southern states to change before they're allowed back. So before they'll be allowed to be a normal state again, they have to prove that they treat African Americans fairly, that they're no longer relying on slave-like labor for their economy. And this would require the North to force Southerners to accept the civil rights of black people, and would also mean getting rid of leading Southerners from before the war. But this would take a lot of time, and it would prevent things from getting back to normal very quickly. On the other hand, the North could allow Southern states back into the country as quickly as possible. And this would allow everything to go back to normal pretty quickly, but it would mean that things in the South wouldn't have changed very much, which could cause problems down the line. And on top of all this, on top of all these problematic choices the North has to make, is the fact that the Southerners, white Southerners at least, don't want any change at all. Most Northerners agreed that something in the South had to change, but most white Southerners wanted to keep things the way they were before the Civil War. And in order to do this, they did both legal and illegal things, the white Southerners did. First of all, white Southerners in many states passed things called black codes. And these were laws that restricted the rights and the freedoms of African Americans in southern states. On top of this, the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, starts up around the end of the Civil War in the late 1860s. And this group starts up with the explicit goal of preventing Southern black people from gaining their rights. And they use violence and they use fear in order to prevent black people from claiming their political rights. And this makes any sort of change very difficult because the South is willing to resort to violence to prevent change from occurring. All right, thanks for paying attention to that overview. We will go over this tomorrow in class and talk about these issues in more detail later.